In the year 2035, the world has become a wasteland. Many years earlier, some had already foreseen this fate. So, global elites ramped up their extraction and competition for resources. Pollution worsened dramatically, eventually triggering extreme climate change. Ice caps melted, and natural disasters began erupting all over the planet. Viruses spread rapidly among the population, crop yields plummeted, and life became increasingly unbearable for the poor. Driven by greed and the pursuit of power, war broke out. More and more nations joined in, and soon, mushroom clouds bloomed across the globe. When the elites realized Earth was no longer habitable, they called a ceasefire, and then they made a monumental decision. All elite individuals and their families would migrate to a distant planet named Kepler, 209. As for those who weren't chosen, they were left behind to struggle on the shattered Earth. 200 years passed in the blink of an eye. But on Kepler, the high levels of radiation had a devastating consequence. They could no longer reproduce. Then, they discovered new data from one of the weather beacons left on Earth. It showed signs of reproductive activity in a certain region. And so, they launched the Return to Earth initiative. The first expedition team spent years drifting through space before reaching Earth, but contact with them was soon lost. Decades later, the people of Kepler, unable to wait any longer, dispatched a second exploration team. But as their pod entered Earth's atmosphere, disaster struck. The vessel crash-landed near the Henderson Hub shoreline. One crew member died on impact. Only Blake and a male teammate survived. Over 2 centuries, Earth had been healing from the scars left by humanity. Pollution in the air and nuclear radiation had vanished. They had only 6 hours before the tide would return and flood the area. They needed to gather information and send it back to Kepler before then. While testing the water, they discovered unknown substances. Then, they spotted marine life. It was a clear sign. Earth had regained the ability to support reproduction. Blake quickly took out a device to test whether her own body could now conceive. But the results left them disappointed. Just then, thick fog began rolling in. Blake became disoriented. Her teammate fired a signal flare. It helped Blake find her way, but it also attracted something far more dangerous. When Blake returned, the pod and her teammate were gone. Drag marks on the ground made it clear. Something or someone had taken them. She followed the trail, and what she saw next left her in shock. There were still survivors on Earth. As Blake stood frozen, unsure what to do, a group of native inhabitants suddenly appeared behind her. They knocked her unconscious. When she woke up, she and her teammate had been thrown into a water prison. Blake tried to communicate, but after 2 centuries, language had evolved. They couldn't understand each other. What shocked Blake even more was that there were children here. They had to get this information back to Kepler. But her teammate was growing weaker by the minute, losing too much blood. Not wanting to drag her down, he entrusted the mission to Blake and took his own life with a hidden poison capsule. At that moment, memories came rushing back to Blake. Her father had been part of the very first team sent back to Earth. She remembered the day he gave her 2 boxes of matches. They had been passed down from her grandfather, and now they were hers. The two had made a promise. When the match was lit, they would meet again. Now, Blake held the last match in her hand, but after all these years, she still hadn't dared to light it. She feared, if she did, she would never see her father again. Suddenly, seawater began pouring in. The water level rose rapidly. Just as it seemed like her life would end there, a native appeared. Blake was rescued. She stared quietly at her surroundings. Her teammate's body was recovered as well. When night fell, the natives set his body adrift on a small raft lit by candlelight and sent him into the ocean. Blake didn't cry. She didn't mourn. From a young age, they were taught one belief: everything must be done for the greater good. Though the natives lived in hardship, their faces glowed with genuine happiness. Blake looked up at the pitch-black sky and recalled her father's words about rivers and mountains. Despite Kepler's advanced technology and its ability to explore the stars, they still couldn't recreate forests, oceans, or lakes. When her father left for Earth, he took with him a collection of plant seeds. He hoped that when his daughter returned to Earth, she would see the blue planet as described in their books. Now, countless eyes on Kepler watched the departing ship and shouted their motto in unison. After the tide receded, Blake was thrown back into the water prison. Before long, a curious young girl appeared. Her name was Mila. Even though they didn't speak the same language, the two managed to communicate using gestures and drawings. Once trust was built, Blake asked Mila to help retrieve her fertility testing device. As she watched the girl disappear into the distance, Blake finally felt a sense of hope. But Mela didn't return. Instead, a frantic woman showed up, a mother in distress. She forced several girls into the water prison and tossed in a baby wrapped in cloth. Blake was horrified, unable to make sense of what was happening. Gunshots rang out above. Blake climbed to the top of the cave and finally saw the truth. A gang of raiders was attacking the small village. They were seizing supplies and people. The gunfire and screams eventually faded. A woman pulled aside the covering above them. Her name was Narvik. She was Mela's mother. Mela had been taken by the raiders. When Blake stepped back onto the surface, the once lively village was now in ruins. Red stained the water. Lifeless bodies lay across the ground. Several young children ran to Narvik, but she couldn't take care of them. Her daughter was waiting for her. Blake followed Narvik, determined to retrieve her device. She had no one else to rely on. To her surprise, Narvik could speak their language, but Narvik didn't seem interested in explanations. Suddenly, Mila's scream pierced the air in the distance. The raiders were loading their ship. The two women stood no chance against them. Desperate to save her daughter, Narvik pulled out a signal flare, ready to attack the ship. But Blake stopped her. It was a useless move, but she couldn't convince Narvik otherwise. Left with no choice, Blake knocked her out. Then she fired the flare far into the distance, drawing attention away, before sneaking aboard the ship alone. She searched frantically, and finally found her bag tangled in fishing nets. Just as she retrieved it, the raiders returned to the ship. With nowhere to run, Blake slipped into the lower decks and blended into the crowd. She curled up in a corner. The damp air and cold sea breeze made her shiver uncontrollably. A man noticed and offered her his coat, but Blake felt no gratitude. In her eyes, these people were the reason her mission had failed, the reason her teammate had died. When the ship reached land again, they arrived at a massive ship graveyard. As the raiders searched their spoils, they came across Blake's weapon. The man's eyes lit up. He wanted to know whose it was. Blake lowered her head, hoping not to draw attention. But Blake was still discovered by the man. Just when she thought she was done for, she was brought to the captain's quarters. There, she met a young boy and a familiar face. Gibson had once traveled to Earth with her father, but they lost contact long ago. At that moment, Blake only wanted one thing, to see her father. But unfortunately, he had already passed away. Back when they first returned to Earth, they encountered the native inhabitants. Gibson called them mud people, labeling them as an uncivilized species. He and Blake's father had made a decision to share knowledge with these so-called mud people. But unexpectedly, one day, the mud people rebelled. They destroyed everything. And even now, Gibson had no idea why they turned. It was during that chaos that Blake's father was killed. Blake kept repeating to herself, "For the greater good," trying to numb the pain in her heart. But her father's image wouldn't stop replaying in her mind. The next morning, something happened that erased Blake's sorrow in an instant. Just days after returning to Earth, she experienced her first menstrual cycle. After breakfast, Gibson took her to the base's school. The classroom was filled with girls, nothing but girls. Their faces were lit up with joy and excitement. They had waited for this moment for so long. Each of them was eager to meet their savior in person. They showed off their talents and bombarded Blake with curious questions. As Blake patiently responded, Mela suddenly walked into the classroom. The moment their eyes met, Blake felt something unsettling deep inside. She couldn't quite explain it. After leaving the classroom, Blake made her way to the captain's room. There she met Neil, Gibson's son. Blake was puzzled. Why didn't Neil have to go to class? The answer? He had a personal tutor. Neil walked to the window. As he pulled back the curtain, a small sapling appeared in Blake's line of sight. Neil began describing what Earth used to look like, and Blake froze. She asked who had taught him all this. The answer stunned her. Her father. Blake was overwhelmed, with excitement and with rage. Her father was alive. So why had Gibson lied to her? She begged Neil to take her to him, but Neil said he couldn't get there on his own. Determined, Blake tore down a map of the base and set off alone. As she was leaving, she ran into Gibson's right-hand man. Soon after, Blake finally saw that familiar silhouette. Her heart was racing. As she tried to open the door, Gibson appeared. Blake demanded the truth. Gibson told her the rebellion wasn't started by the mud people. It was started by her father. And it was all for a mud woman. Blake couldn't believe it. She refused to accept that her father would betray her for someone else. But the truth is often painful. Her heart shattered. 15 years of waiting, 15 years of effort, all to see her father again. As a father, he knew he had failed his daughter, but he had to stop history from repeating itself. Still, Blake was too heartbroken. She turned and walked away. She looked toward the weather station. She had a plan: to connect her pregnancy scanner and transmit the data to Kepler. Kepler needed proof that Earth could support reproduction again. Her restored cycle was that proof. That gave Gibson hope. But their temporary alliance was shattered that very night. Gibson invited Blake and his family to dinner. It was Blake's first time speaking with Gibson's wife, Mooney. Years ago, Mooney had nearly drowned while pregnant. Gibson rescued her and delivered her baby, Neil, via an emergency operation. That's how they became a family. The atmosphere was warm until a single dish changed everything. Gibson suddenly grabbed Neil's hand for eating without utensils and angrily forced him to use a knife and fork. Terror filled the boys' and Mooney's faces. Just then, an alert sounded from the base's shop. Guards stormed in. Someone had broken in and sabotaged the power supply. Curious, Blake slipped out to investigate, only to be ambushed. The intruder was Narvik, Mayla's mother. Blake didn't resist. She knew what it felt like to be separated from family. Narvik soon found Mayla, but before they could escape, a guard spotted them. Blake couldn't bear the guard's cruelty and attacked him. More guards swarmed in. Blake tried to explain the situation, to plead for Narvik and her daughter, but her words were ignored. Brutality was the only response. At that moment, Blake realized she had no real voice here, and the mud people were treated like livestock. After Narvik and Mayla were taken away, Blake confronted Gibson. That's when she learned Narvik had once been a guard here too, but betrayed them for unknown reasons. Now, with Kepler's return, the descendants of those abandoned long ago were once again being enslaved. As their argument escalated, guards entered, with Blake's missing bag, but the device wasn't inside. Gibson erupted in rage. After everyone left, Gibson noticed something in Neil's hand, a doll. It belonged to Mayla. Inside it was the device they had been searching for. Blake had just returned to her room when she heard a noise in the cabinet. She opened it and saw a terrified, confused face. Mayla threw herself into Blake's arms. The girl was shaking. Blake promised to rescue her mother. Just then, someone knocked at the door. Gibson's henchman entered under the pretense of a search. Once a mud person himself, he now considered himself one of the Keplerians. He even wanted to experience what it was like to be with a Kepler woman. Blake found it laughable, pathetic even, but her reaction enraged him. As things escalated near the wall, a noise came from the cabinet. The man grew suspicious, stepping closer. In that moment, Blake lunged at him and kissed him, holding him tightly. Hormones clouded his mind. Blake covered his mouth before he could cry out. Then came the sound of shattering glass. The poison she carried seeped into his system. He died in pain, angry and powerless. Blake freed the imprisoned mud people. They picked up weapons and began to fight back. Under Blake's cover, the guards fell one by one. At last, everyone escaped the steel fortress. Blake looked toward the weather station. She had to stop Gibson. At that moment, Gibson had just taken Neil's blood sample. Compared to Blake, the boy was an even stronger piece of evidence. That's when Blake learned the truth. Neil was her brother. Her father's lover was Mooney. Gibson descended into madness. All he could think about was transmitting the data back to Kepler. Mooney, desperate to protect her son, finally stood up to him. But Gibson shot her. Blake, trying to save Neil, dropped her weapon. Once the area was secure, Gibson connected the transmitter and sent the blood sample to Kepler. Blake seized the chance and tackled him, both plunging into the deep sea. She would drag this man to the depths of hell, even if it cost her life. As time passed, a figure raced toward Blake in the water. Mayla watched her mother anxiously. Thanks to Narvik, Blake survived. Her father could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The boat continued into the distance. Blake sat beside Neil and handed him the last match. They didn't know if the data had reached Kepler. They didn't know if anyone would come, but they were ready for whatever came next. Soon after, several helpless children looked toward the horizon, and in the distance, they saw their loved ones returning.